the fall, spiritual war. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. Genesis 3:1a. Every story has a beginning, and every story also has a turn. We met the hero of the Bible, the Lord God, creator of all things. He is the protagonist, the hero. And the first two chapters of Genesis show us his good plans. Genesis chapter 3 introduces the antagonist, the villain. The serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field. Now, let's dispel one myth immediately. The serpent was not a talking snake. Now, I know the serpent is often depicted as a snake in Sunday school, but there is much more going on. For now, diving it too much into the Hebrew language would not serve us well. So let's just say this: the Hebrew word for serpent has multiple meanings, or has a broad, deep meaning. And all of that together helps us know that this serpent is more than a snake. He is a divine being. Well, who is the serpent? The prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel give us some of the only background information we have on the serpent's identity. Let's look at Ezekiel first. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. You were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire, you walked. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created, till unrighteousness was found in you. So I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fires. Your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. That's Ezekiel 28, verses 13 through 17. So we see that the serpent was an anointed guardian cherub, covered in every precious stone. He resided in the Garden of Eden, and he was blameless until he sinned. So how exactly did the serpent sin? Well, Isaiah provides some answers for us. So Isaiah chapter 14. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. Above the stars of God, I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. So that's Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 through 15. So this anointed guardian cherub rebelled. His beauty turned his heart to sinful vanity and pride, and so he schemed to perform a coup, and the Lord cast him down from his position. So this was the shot heard round the universe. A created being has now rebelled against his creator and began a spiritual war. And by New Testament times, this rebelling guardian cherub was identified as the devil, the old serpent, the dragon, the accuser, the adversary, or just plain old Satan. Fatal temptation. If you recall from Genesis chapter 2, God gave Adam one prohibition. Genesis 2:17. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. Now, the serpent knew this, so one day he approached God's imager, Eve, and said, Did God actually say you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? Now, that's Genesis. That's the second half of Genesis 3:1. What followed was a conversation that was filled with half truths and veiled deceptions. Eve's response even offers clues that she and Adam had added to God's prohibition. She responded to him, they aren't even to touch the tree in the midst of the garden in chapter 3, verse 3. Now that's more than what God had commanded. God only said that they should not eat from it. So the serpent puts forth two lies. The first lie is you will not surely die. And the second lie is you will become like God. So let's look at those one at a time. You will not surely die. Now, in one sense, this was true. Okay, Adam and Eve did not immediately suffer physical death. However, ultimately, they did die, albeit it was a very long time later. But there was a death that happened at that moment. They experienced immediate spiritual death. The second lie, you will become like God. Now, this was a lie because as imagers, they were already like God. Now, they weren't just like him, but they were imaging him. So the serpent played on Eve's intuition that though they were imagers, they weren't actually identical to God, just like him. He caused her to doubt her understanding of her identity. And she took the bait and ate the forbidden fruit and enticed her husband Adam to do so as well. Now remember, God gave Adam a job: work and keep the garden. So his position gave him complete oversight of the garden, which made him responsible for everything that happened within its borders. So many try to blame Eve for the fall because she's the one who Satan successfully tempted. However, Adam is held responsible. It's his failure that enabled her failure. So all of this brings up a great question. Why did the serpent tempt Eve at all? What did humanity have that made Satan desire their destruction? Well, this divine rebel had declared war on his creator. And anyone that represented or imaged him became targets of his hatred. Curses and consequences. Genesis 3:7. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. Now, eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil did two immediate things. First, it created a separation between themselves and the Lord. Now remember, they immediately suffered a spiritual death which severed their life-sustaining relationship with God. Secondly, it opened their eyes, and suddenly they understood that they were naked. Now, apart from a life-giving relationship with their God, their nakedness made them feel shame for their physical differences, so they made loincloths to cover themselves. So what follows then is the Lord's curse and consequences. He found Adam and Eve hiding from him. He asked them what happened, and he listened to them shift blame, and then he did the following. First, the Lord cursed the serpent and issued a promise that one day Eve's offspring would overcome him. That's chapter 3, verses 14 through 15. Next, he increased Eve's childbirth pains and declared that her relationship with Adam would be defined by ongoing struggle. But Adam would be the head. That's chapter 3, verse 16. Just a side note there, it's interesting that it says that he increased Eve's childbirth pains. So that means that seems to tell us that it wasn't pain-free, but after the curse, it was much more painful than it once was. The next one, number 3, the Lord cursed the ground so that Adam would have increased labor in working it. So he would work it by the sweat of his brow. That's chapter 3, verse 17. And finally, death entered creation. Adam and Eve would eventually die physically. Chapter 3, verse 19. Then it says, "Therefore the Lord God sent him out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life." Genesis 3:23 through 24. So a spiritual war that began between a divine rebel and his creator spilled over into humanity. Adam and Eve chose to listen to Satan's temptation. They chose to forge their own path, and it cost them their divine connection with the Lord. They were cast out of God's garden, just as Satan was also cast out in Ezekiel 28:16. Age of Covenants. God's story took a turn with the fall, although he was not surprised. He's God. He knows everything. He knows everything that's going to happen. And Adam and Eve sinned and fell from their station, taking all of future humanity with them. But don't think for a moment that this surprised the Lord. The fall only set the next phase of his plan into motion. So Genesis 3:15 contains the first promise of the gospel, which is the good news. Genesis 3:15, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." So the promise that Eve's offspring would bruise, some translations say crush, the serpent's head was the pistol shot that began the race. The essence of the promise to the serpent is this: you deceived Adam and Eve, but one day their descendant, a human, will succeed where they failed, defeat you, and become the new head of a new humanity. To accomplish the promise of an offspring who would defeat Satan, God entered into a series of covenants with humans. Now, these covenants form what many scholars and theologians call the scarlet thread of redemption. And this scarlet thread weaves its way all through the Old Testament, okay? So what is a covenant? Well, 21st century Western people don't typically have a firm grasp on the meaning of covenant. In fact, apart from the legal world and religious circles, the word itself has entirely fallen out of use. We are more familiar with contracts than covenants. So in light of that, let's define covenant. A covenant is an agreement founded upon the character of the concerned individuals. So unlike contracts, which are built upon legal agreement, covenants are built upon moral integrity. If a contract is violated, there are legal consequences that can be settled in court. If a covenant is broken, there are no legal consequences. Instead, there are relational consequences. In God's story, he established covenants and not contracts. Why? Because the Lord desires relationships with people, not legally binding behaviors. Covenants are relational. The Bible is clear that God, not people, started every covenant between God and people. And that's an exciting thought. So if God is initiating the covenant, then that covenant is founded upon his character. I mean, and ours, but we are terrible, okay? But his character never fails or changes. Now, God initiates two kinds of covenants. There are unconditional covenants and there are conditional covenants. Unconditional covenants have no stipulations or rules with consequences. Conditional covenants have these kind of if-then terms. So if you do this, then this will happen. Typically, there are favorable terms for obedience and unfavorable or negative terms for disobedience. And the Lord's covenants had one large-scale purpose: to prepare the way for Eve's offspring. Now, our study's goal isn't to analyze each covenant, but here's a chronological synopsis of the major covenants that God made with humanity in the Old Testament. The first one is the redemption covenant. This is what we just read, Genesis 3:15. It's a covenant, although I will say that word is not used in Genesis 3:15, but it is nonetheless a covenant that God would bring forth Eve's offspring who will defeat the serpent. And this is an unconditional covenant. The next covenant that we encounter is the Noahic covenant. Genesis chapter 9, it contains God's covenant with Noah and all other living creatures, and even the earth itself, that he would never again destroy the world by a flood. God gave the rainbow as a sign of that covenant. So this is also an unconditional covenant. The next covenant we encounter is the Abrahamic covenant. In Genesis chapter 12, God initiates a covenant with Abraham to bless all nations through his family. Then in Genesis 15, God affirms that covenant again. And then in Genesis 17, God gave circumcision as the sign of the covenant. And in Genesis 22, God confirms his covenant with Abraham one final time. So this covenant now was a conditional covenant because it was contingent upon Abraham believing the Lord, Genesis 15:6, and upon circumcision, Genesis 17:14. The next covenant we encounter is the Mosaic covenant. The covenant God made through Moses. It spans the book of Exodus all the way through Deuteronomy. This covenant includes the giving of the Ten Commandments, laws for Israel's civil government, and ceremonial laws for worship in the tabernacle. And this covenant was sealed through various animal sacrifices prescribed in the law. This was also a conditional covenant with blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience in Deuteronomy chapter 28. The last covenant we encounter is the Davidic covenant. God initiated a covenant with King David in 2 Samuel chapter 7 verses 12 through 16, which promised that David's throne would endure forever. His royal family would possess an everlasting kingdom. Now, this covenant led to Jesus Christ, a descendant of David, and he is the King of Kings. So the Davidic covenant was unconditional because it did not depend on David's family's character and morality, but on God's character to see it through. Now, it's important to understand that these covenants prepared the way for Jesus, each one progressively narrowing the path. God made the big promise in Genesis 3:15 to send an offspring. God promised to never destroy the world again by water, renewing his commitment to redeeming humanity. In Abraham, God narrowed his focus to one family and covenanted to bless the whole world through his son Isaac and then Jacob, who would later be called Israel. When Israel had grown, he became enslaved to Egypt. And God rescued them through Moses and initiated a covenant that would make them a holy nation. And then God narrowed the path once more to Israel's royal family and established a covenant with King David. King David's throne would be established forever in his descendant, Jesus the Messiah. So when you read the Old Testament, the stories you read are all smaller pieces of God's story. When you're reading through Judges or meditating on the Psalms, it's easy to lose sight of the big picture. But each smaller story indeed has its own characters, its own context and message for the reader, but it is connected to the grand big picture of God's story. Therefore, each small story is its own adventure, but also a wheel that's rolling us forward in God's plan to redeem all things. Increased rebellion. Genesis 6:6, and the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. The fall isn't only about Satan's fall, Adam and Eve's subsequent fatal decision to follow him in rebellion, and God's covenants. The fall showcases on repeat how wicked humans become in the absence of a loyal relationship with the Lord. Our increasing wickedness became evident quickly in Genesis chapter 4 when Cain killed Abel. It only took one generation for us to commit murder. From there, the sin of mankind only increased. It increased so much that in Genesis 6, the Lord decided to flood the earth and start over with Noah and his family. However, Noah wasn't perfect, and neither were his sons. It was only 3 generations later. You can see this in Genesis chapter 10, verse 9 and 25, and then Genesis 11, 1 through 9, that the Lord judged humanity again at Babel, confusing their languages and sending them out from each other. After God chose Abraham and established a covenant with him, Abraham continued to demonstrate his sinfulness, as did Isaac, as did Jacob, and for sure, as did all of Jacob's sons. So Israel, God's chosen people, they couldn't keep it together either. Only a fraction of Israel's entire national existence was spent in obedience to the Lord. So the increased rebellion of humanity is also linked to the ongoing conflict in the spirit realm. Satan's rebellion led to more divine rebels who joined him. The nations worshipped these rebelling spirits as their own gods, who led them deeper and deeper into increased sin and debauchery. So an angel gives the prophet Daniel a glimpse into the spiritual princes who have authority over the nations. You can look at that in Daniel chapter 10, verse 13 and verse 20. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul references these spiritual forces of darkness as authorities, cosmic powers, spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. Ephesians 6, verse 12. Humans are wicked all on our own, but we receive an assist in our depravity from these cosmic powers who work to blind the world to the truth of the gospel, 2 Corinthians 4:4. Here are the big ideas that you should have learned about the fall. The primary antagonist, the villain in God's story, is the rebelling guardian cherub, Satan. Satan successfully tempted Adam and Eve, luring them into his rebellion against God. God then enacted covenants with humanity, promising that he would redeem them through the offspring of Eve. The covenants gradually narrow in focus from all of humanity to one family, to one nation, to just Israel's royal line, which leads to Jesus Christ. And this is called the scarlet thread of redemption. The fall was the beginning of a spiritual war that led to more divine rebels joining Satan, determined to mislead the nations and increase humanity's rebellion. This is the current state of humanity. The human race is still fallen, and every person is born in the fallen, sinful condition that Adam and Eve chose for us. The spiritual war also continues. This is the current state of humanity. The human race is still fallen. Every person is born in the fallen, sinful condition that Adam and Eve chose for us. The spiritual war also continues to rage. Satan and the cosmic powers who followed him in rebellion work constantly to deceive humanity, keeping them in bondage and blinding them to the truth of the gospel.